The archive labeled it as a statistical error. It sat on the 23rd shelf of the War Probabilities Repository, marked with the pale gray sigil reserved for non-reproducible anomalies. I had walked past it many times, letting my gaze slide over its designation without stopping. There were always more urgent models to refine, more recent wars to quantify. On the 370th cycle of my service, the anomaly was reassigned to me. I moved the file cube to my desk and watched as the air above it filled with light. Data columns unfolded like a glass forest, sensor logs, combat telemetry, casualty curves, psychological indices. The battle's name flickered into view, rendered in the trade tongue. Engagement Theta Black 19, human designation Cressida Ridge, outcome hegemony tactical victory, human ground forces annihilated. Nothing unusual in that. What made it an anomaly was not that the humans had fought, they always fought, but that they had refused to break long after every predictive model insisted they would. I recalled the summary from my training years. Cressida Ridge had been presented as a curiosity, a human battalion holding a hopeless line against overwhelming orbital and ground forces, a brave but strategically irrelevant last stand. Back then, I accepted that interpretation. Now it was my task to prove it wrong. I sank my fronds into the interface ports and let the data descend. The war map appeared first, a wireframe of the ridge and valley system on the colony's northern continent. Blue markers denoted hegemony units. Amber markers indicated human forces. A thin, jagged line of amber clung to the high ground like residue. Even in abstraction, the disposition looked desperate. I overlaid the initial projections. Our model said the humans would withdraw from the ridge by hour +6, preserving most of their strength for a secondary defensive line deeper in the interior. It was the optimal course of action, given their supply constraints and our orbital fire control. They did not withdraw. At hour +10, casualty rates for the human battalion exceeded 38%. The standard breakpoint for comparable species under comparable conditions lies between 18 and 22. They did not break. I watched the timeline play forward. Orbital strikes walked across the ridge, gouging trenches of molten rock. Blue markers surged and receded. Amber markers dimmed, went dark, and were replaced by faint gray crosses. At hour +19, the battalion's functional strength fell below 20%. Ammunition reports dipped into single digits. Med litters overflowed. Medics reclassified their work from stabilization for evacuation to simple comfort until death. At that moment, the model displayed a red vertical line. Predicted route, 99.73% probability. The amber marks remained where they were. They did not route. I disconnected, letting the war map dissolve. My chamber was silent but for the hum of coolant veins. On the opposite wall, the hegemony's celebrated equations glowed softly, a mural of predicted surrenders and orderly collapses, the math that had won us a dozen campaigns. Cressida Ridge was a flaw in that mural, a hairline crack running through the painted certainty. I reopened the data forest and filtered for irregularities. Command interference, none reported. Jamming artifacts, within expected variance. Unknown technologies, negative. I sank deeper. Combat chatter filled my auditory nodes, translated into clean, neutral trade speech by the archive's old but adequate systems. Most of it was clipped and focused. Range calls, ammunition counts, casualty reports. It was the language of organized desperation. Squads confirming sectors, leaders redistributing their last magazines, medics shouting for space that no longer existed. What caught my attention was not what they said about the enemy, but what they did not say about themselves. In model space, at that level of attrition, some variation of the same questions almost always appears. Troops ask for evacuation routes. They propose fallback positions. They inquire about surrender terms. Sometimes they simply beg for extraction. In the transcripts from Cressida Ridge, such requests were absent. Instead, I saw a recurring concern with the status of adjoining units. One section asked repeatedly whether another was still holding. Fire teams checked on the wounded and on the supply teams dragging ammunition up the slope. The pattern was clear. They were primarily concerned with whether anyone else was still standing beside them. Threaded through the tactical language was a word I had seen in other human records, one that resisted precise translation: home. The term did not appear as a simple coordinate or strategic asset. It surfaced in phrases that treated it as if it had a face and a voice, as if it could be disappointed or betrayed. I tagged the term and moved on. At hour +12, the humans received their last confirmed transmission from Orbital Command. The file hovered before me like a small, bright wound. The voice belonged to their theater commander, strained by distance and interference. The meaning survived the distortion. The orbital shield grid was failing. Our fire was bleeding through. Reinforcements had been diverted to other theaters. There would be no relief. The commander acknowledged that Cressida Ridge had already bought time for the evacuation of 2 cities and several outlying habitats. According to their own calculations, the battalion should already have collapsed. It had not. There were no corridors left to open, no ships to send, no path to survival the commander could offer. Then came the sentence that unsettled me most. The commander told them to make their own choices. In our doctrine, such a phrase is almost indistinguishable from an admission of defeat, a formal recognition that command coherence has failed. When troops are granted that freedom and survival remains an option, they almost always choose it. At Cressida Ridge, survival did not remain an option. Yet the battalion continued to fight for 19 more hours. I opened a branching analysis window and began populating it with factors. Indoctrination, high, but not unprecedented. Many expansionist cultures teach their soldiers to value sacrifice. Psychotropic reinforcement, negative. Medical logs showed no systematic dispersal of stimulants beyond minor analgesics. Command presence, severed at hour +12, relief probability, approaching 0 by hour +14. I fed the matrix to the modeling core and watched as it tried to absorb Cressida Ridge. 512 iterations later, the core rejected the dataset. Unresolved behavior. Variance exceeded threshold. The anomaly had grown, not shrunk. I did something then that my supervisors would have discouraged had any of them been watching. I set aside the strategic overlays and reached for the low-priority attachments, anything marked personal, redundant, extraneous. These were the fragments automated filters often misfiled as noise. Tucked between casualty manifests and supply tallies, I found a cluster of audio tags. They were small, unencrypted, and named not with coordinates or unit codes, but with human words. Letters. The archive translated the label for me. I hesitated longer than was rational, then opened the first. There were no battle sounds, no clipped command protocol, only a single hoarse voice speaking into a recorder. A human soldier apologized to someone far away for leaving a roof unfinished on the north side of a house. He described wind whistling through beams, tools left on a particular shelf, children who liked to watch lightning at night. He could not promise to come home, but he could promise not to make it easy for the enemy while those people were behind him. Another file carried the tone of a young adult addressing a parent. The soldier mused that they might have chosen a different life, something involving distant universities and quiet cities, but insisted that their presence on the ridge was the reason anyone could reroute the local grid at all. They asked for scolding later, if later existed, and spoke of trying to return with all unnecessary parts still attached. The crucial phrase surfaced at the end of that message. The soldier wanted someone to know that they had not broken. Not that they had survived, not that they had won. Simply that they had met some internal standard of not breaking. I scanned the cluster. The sentiment echoed across multiple voices in different arrangements. Some spoke of not breaking while a partner or child believed in them. Others anchored themselves to the memory of a promise made years earlier, now fulfilled in the most brutal possible way. It did not sound like a doctrine imposed from above. It sounded like a private pact shared aloud, each speaker reassuring someone who would likely never hear the recording. These were not messages composed in the calm of safety. They were decisions fossilized in waveform. I checked the timestamps. Many of the letters had been recorded in the hours before the battalion dug into Cressida Ridge. Others came just after confirmation that the evacuation transports were full. A few had never been transmitted off-world at all. The archive had recovered them from damaged personal devices in the aftermath. Then I found a file tagged by an automated process as unusual motivational content. It had been routed through the battalion's internal channel at hour plus 13 after the final transmission from Orbital Command. The commander's voice returned, distorted but intelligible. There would be no miracle. The transports were already gone. By every model available, the ridgeline should have collapsed hours earlier. It had not. The battalion had already defied the probabilities. The commander did not give a heroic speech about dying for a strip of rock. Instead, they spoke of the people behind them, cities full of civilians who had strapped children into cold seats on overcrowded ships because they believed that the line on the ridge would hold long enough. The commander framed what was coming not as an order, but as a choice shared by all of them. They could retreat into the dirt and let the math be right, or they could remain where they were and become the error in the equations. The response was not recorded as cheering or shouted oaths. It appeared in the logs as a series of acknowledgments, squads confirming their positions, units reporting their dwindling ammunition, medics stating how many they could still keep breathing for a little longer. It was a pattern of acceptance, not of survival, but of the cost of refusing to break. I stopped playback and sat in the dimness of my chamber. On the wall, our doctrine's mural glowed faintly, equations cascading through predicted behaviors like water over carved stone. We build our confidence on the assumption that all sentient combatants, when pressed hard enough, will choose continuity of the self. They will preserve nerve and flesh when the alternative is annihilation. It is not cowardice. It is arithmetic. Survival allows for future options. Surrender can be bargained upward. Retreat can become counterattack. The humans at Cressida Ridge had done the arithmetic. They knew there were no options left for them, so they chose something else to preserve. Not their bodies. The casualty curves made that plain. Not their strategic position. The ridge fell, and with it any hope of holding that continent. They preserved a promise. They refused to betray the trust placed in them by those who could no longer see them and by those who would never know their names. I called up the casualty curves again, now with that context. 93% dead or missing by hour plus 20, 0 desertions, 0 recorded attempts to slip past the ridgeline and vanish into the interior, not a single authenticated request for surrender terms. The battalion at Cressida Ridge did not die because they were denied an escape. They died because, collectively, they declined it. The implications for our models were profound. I opened a new document in the archive, designation blinking, Auditor's Addendum. My fronds hovered over the input fields for several long breaths before I began. Preliminary conclusion. The behavior of human units under extreme duress cannot be fully captured by frameworks that prioritize individual survival or immediate strategic gain. There exists a non-quantified variable, which I named promise cohesion, deriving from perceived obligations to absent parties. When promise cohesion is sufficiently high, human forces may voluntarily forego all self-preserving options, even when fully aware of their futility, in order to uphold an internal standard of not breaking. This behavior resists rationalization as mass delusion or pure fanaticism. It functions as a distributed, emotionally reinforced calculation of identity. I thought of the letters. the unfinished roof on the north side of a house that might never be repaired by its owner, the tree behind that dwelling, the child who might one day walk under beams her father had not inspected, knowing only that someone had stood on a ridge so she could exist at all. I added a recommendation. All future projections involving human adversaries must account for scenarios in which units continue to resist far beyond established breakpoints, provided they believe their refusal to break preserves a promise to others, even if those others will never witness the act. The formal phrasing could not bear the full weight of what I had seen. I added one final note outside the numbered sections. It was not standard practice. It was, in fact, discouraged. As a personal observation, I wrote that any law governing human conduct in such moments was not written in the language of probability. It was closer to a sentence I had heard repeated among their dead, a phrase that recurred in their letters and logs. We do not break. I sealed the file and returned the anomaly cube to its place on the shelf. Its sigil shifted from pale gray to a deeper warning color, the shade reserved for phenomena that demand respect. We will fight them again. The hegemony always does, with any species that reaches for the same stars. Our admirals will ask for probabilities as they always have. I will give them numbers. I will refine my curves. I will chart the likely lines of human advance and retreat. But somewhere, behind every tidy equation, there will be a ridge of rock under an alien sky, and a line that does not move long after it should have shattered, an unbroken place in the math. The day we believed they would break and they chose not to.